Just south of Miami, not so far away, there is a special place with stories to tell and visions to share, a place called the Charles Deering Estate. On this land, where the waters of Biscayne Bay lap against a fertile earth, 10,000 years ago there lived saber-toothed tigers, woolly mammoths, horses, dire wolves, jaguars, llamas, and paleo-Indians, hunting for survival, living and dying and leaving bones for the ages, waiting to be discovered. On this land 4,000 years ago, there lived a native people whose culture flourished for millennia, and who became known 500 years ago as Tequesta, when the Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon sailed into Biscayne Bay seeking the sweet, fresh water gushing from the Everglades. On this land, 200 years ago, Seminoles roamed the wilderness, followed by settlers from the Bahamas and Key West, vying for the richness of the coveted hunting grounds.
There was so much found at the Deering Estate during our archaeological assessments. We were finding prehistoric pottery, tools made out of shell and bone, all kinds of evidence of how prehistoric people were living and surviving there. And then through the historic period, including the town of Cutler, where we were finding individual homesteads and remnants of wells and walls, we were learning so much about what pioneer life in the Deering Estate and the town of Cutler was like.
In 1838, Dr. Henry Perrine staked a claim for 36 square miles of federal land to cultivate tropical plants, a claim unresolved for decades after he was killed in 1840 by Seminoles attacking Indian Keys. In 1864 came the Addisons, John and Mary, hardy cracker pioneers who farmed for 40 years and made their home a welcoming landmark for all, including their one-time enemies, the Seminoles. Dr. William Cutler bought 600 acres on Biscayne Bay near the Addisons in 1883, and the area's first post office would bear his name. Dr. Cutler proved a good friend to his less affluent neighbors, defending their rights to the land as homesteaders in a fierce legal battle with the Perrines, who were supported by the railroad. In 1897, President Grover Cleveland awarded the land grant to the heirs of Dr. Perrine, with John and Mary Addison receiving clear title to their land. The way was now clear for new settlements, and the boom was on. In 1900, the Richmond Cottage opened its doors as the most southerly hotel on the mainland of the United States, managed by the enterprising Edith Richmond, with guests including Henry M. Flagler. By 1912, Flagler's FEC Model Land Company was going full throttle, developing land for his new railroad and attracting investors and agriculture that would forever change the native land, and attracting the concern of wealthy industrialist and world traveler Charles Deering. Charles Deering was a Renaissance man, a man of culture and accomplishment, a man who understood science and directed an international company.
Charles Deering believed in the vertical integration of the company. In the Navy, he learned that the supply line was probably the most important thing that you could have in the Navy, and he believed that for the manufacturing of harvesting equipment as well. So International Harvester benefited from the Deering Manufacturing and Harvesting Company to have 100,000 acres of forest land from which they could get the wood needed to build their equipment. They had 40,000 tons of iron ore in Wisconsin. They had 20,000 acres of coal fields in Kentucky, all to power what they needed to do in Chicago. By 1903, International Harvester was the third largest manufacturing company in the world. It was successful beyond anybody's imagination. They were manufacturing over 700,000 pieces of equipment a year. They had 25,000 employees and 42,000 agents working around the country and around the world. They had 65,000 shipments by boxcar out of Chicago every year. They manufactured enough twine in 5 mills to be able to circle the earth every day with twine. It was an amazing operation.
His family's business revolutionized the harvesting of crops and empowered him to pursue his passion for art and architecture and preserving natural places. His vision would create a lasting legacy for this land. Charles had first been attracted to Miami by his father, William, who had a winter home in Coconut Grove. Charles, like James, loved yachting and was a member of Miami's oldest sailing club, the Biscayne Bay Yacht Club. Charles bought property in Miami's Buena Vista section, where he planned a Spanish-style estate, but train noise and encroaching development gave him pause. In 1913, Charles purchased 60 acres of hardwood hammocks south of Miami in Cutler. With downtown Miami growing rapidly and railroad development spreading southward, Charles feared for the future of the native hammock and the pinelands. With an intent to preserve the land, Charles worked for 10 years to assemble parcels from speculators, corporations, and the remaining settlers of Cutler. He brought in renowned botanist Dr. David Fairchild and Dr. John Kunkel Small to oversee landscaping and conduct plant research on his properties. Charles was distressed by the drainage of the Everglades and the devastation of forests, predicting it would change the climate. When the Richmond Cottage closed as a hotel, Charles bought the inn in 1916, remodeled it as a winter home for his family. In 1918, he built a turning basin for his boats and added a carriage house, powerhouse, and pump house. He relocated the original Cutler Road, the main route leading south from Miami, from inside his estate to the outside of a new stone wall, and built a bridge with a Chinese design. He attracted birds, built bird houses, planted groves, windbreaks, and native vegetation. To protect his land from fire and drought, he installed a large water storage tank and irrigation system. By 1922, Charles had acquired the 7-acre Chicken Key, an island 1 mile offshore, and his Cutler reservation was almost complete.
During what we call in American history the Industrial Revolution, too, where these tractor companies became the beginning of modern corporations, James and Charles had the luxury of being able to travel and to buy art. And I think that's, you've got to think about this extreme wealth as being part of his story. And so they went off to Spain and Italy and on all of those great countries. And that's where they picked up this love of architecture. I mean, there's no question about that. They had castles and stuff there first.
Over the years, Charles had traveled the world as a naval officer, a leader of industry, and a connoisseur of art and culture. In 1909, he fell in love with Spain, buying a 14th century hospital to renovate as a summer home. He named it Mar i Cel, Catalan for sea and sky. Other buildings would later be added to the complex, which Charles envisioned as an art center and museum. Charles enriched Maricel with architecture, antiques, and a world-class art collection with paintings by El Greco, Goya, and his lifelong friends Anders Zorn, John Singer Sargent, and Ramon Casas. For his generosity as a patron of fine art and culture, in 1916 Charles was honored by the government of Spain and made an adopted son of Sitges. His legacy is still revered today at the Maricel Museum. Charles had long planned to leave Maricel upon his death as a permanent arts center for Catalonia. But after World War I, legal obstacles thwarted his plans. So in 1921, Charles redirected his energy and art treasures from Sitges back to the United States, to the great benefit of Chicago and Miami. To house hundreds of pieces of art and books he cherished, in 1922 he decided to build a new structure alongside his Richmond cottage at Cutler. He chose Coral Gables architect Phineas Paste to design a 3-story Mediterranean-style house. Remembering the disastrous Chicago fire, Charles commissioned a fireproof building made of oolitic limestone and poured concrete walls with copper-clad and brass doors, and no kitchen. The stone house became a treasure trove of masterpieces. The ballroom lined floor to ceiling with works of fine art, with a stately fireplace given to Charles by his brother James.
Charles Deering and James Deering were very close. They were both well-educated, Charles at Annapolis and then James at Northwestern University and at MIT. They both had a lot of the same interests. They both loved art. They loved nature. They traveled extensively around the world. They enjoyed each other's companies. They got along very well. They got along so well that they worked together for a number of years at both the Deering Harvester Company and at International Harvester. They built homes down here in Miami, James at Vizcaya and Charles here at Cutler, so that they could be close to each other.
When James died in 1925, Charles mourned his loss deeply. Though Charles had homes in Evanston and New York, he sought out Cutler more and more as a comforting retreat, a place where he could quietly enjoy his books and art, his birds and nature, and his correspondence with lifelong friends. Charles was asleep at the Deering estate when the 1926 Great Hurricane devastated Miami, wreaking havoc at Cutler. Afterwards, confined to a wheelchair, deaf and with little vision, Charles still managed to write a letter to his friend Dr. Small, who had inquired about the storm's effect. In a labored handwriting, Charles quipped, "No more botany here. Must go in for geology."
Charles Deering, in the last years of his life, even like James too, had some physical difficulties. In Charles's case, he had difficult walking and was in a wheelchair. But he did have a staff that looked after him. And he pretty much hung out here in this house instead of going out around town. So this became his sanctuary in many cases and his haven in the last years of his life.
5 months after the Great Hurricane, on February 5th, 1927, Charles died peacefully at his stone house overlooking Biscayne Bay. He was buried in the family cemetery in Chicago, his casket covered with flowers from Cutler. His wife Marion and his family continued to own the Deering estate, changing little over the years. After the death of Charles's daughter, Barbara, in 1982, the property became available for sale. Finley Matheson, whose family had been friends of the Deerings for generations, entered into a contract in 1984 to purchase the estate. His announced plans for residential development generated a storm of community interest in saving the property.
Okay, once I got the Deering estate under contract, I realized it really needed to be developed as a park. and not as a typical real estate development. And I needed a lot of support. And I remember going to several meetings with these various organizations where they wanted to kill me. And I was a little nervous about going in there. But when essentially I told them that I was delighted that the state or the county could buy it for a park, that I was on board with all that, they relaxed and we worked together to save it. So the next approach was go to the state and see if they would buy it as a park. And that's where I put all my energy, is working through with the state with something called the Carl Fund to buy endangered lands.
One of the strengths of the land acquisition programs in Florida, they've been done in a very non-political manner, with the basic decisions made by professionals, scientists, historians. But it also helps to have the community express its support for the acquisition, and we certainly had that as it relates to the Deering estate. People like Finley Matheson, Jim Redford, Arva Parks, Marguerite Stoneman Douglas were just part of hundreds of people who indicated their desire to have the Deering estate preserved for our generation and future generations of Floridians.
Newspapers ran articles about the property, and the famous environmentalist Marjorie Stoneman Douglas pronounced,
"There is no parcel of land of greater importance."
In 1985, the Deering estate was purchased by the state of Florida for $22.5 million, with a management agreement signed by Dade County. Soon afterwards, national headlines were made when county archaeologists excavated a large sinkhole on the property and found 10,000-year-old Paleo-Indian bones and artifacts, the first of many archaeological sites to be discovered.
When we began our digging at the Cutler Fossil Site, we were finding large numbers of rocks and boulders that we had to dig through and move out of our way, lots of soil, lots of disarticulated bones. And then suddenly, I think it was on the first week, we actually found the first artifact. It was an artifact made out of bone, and we knew it was something human, but we couldn't really tell how old it was. And then we found the big find, the projectile point, an actual, people we call an arrowhead, and I could tell from the type that it was at least 8,000 to 10,000 years old. That's when we really started to get excited. We knew we had made a major discovery at that point. I had no idea how important it would actually be, because although we were finding very exciting bones of fossil animals long extinct, we hadn't yet found any human remains, and once that occurred, everything really changed. Well, one of the archaeological focal points on the property is the DeQuesta burial mound, and that burial mound is probably about 600 or 700 years old. It has a massive old oak tree growing on it, and it's one of the few burial mounds that have survived in southern Florida. Almost all the others have been annihilated by collectors and by development. So that site is very important. We've never really dug into it because our objective was to preserve the site and respect the fact that it had been intended in perpetuity to preserve the remains of these people.
The discovery of the old Cutler fossil site was important because it added another dimension to the importance of the Deering estate. It also gave us a sense of just how long the property on which we live today has been sought out by birds, animals, and humans, and that the most responsible way in which we can protect those antiquities is by acquisition, so that they are owned and protected by the public and open to the public.
I love the idea. I love sitting here today thinking about there were human beings like us walking around where we're sitting 10,000 years ago. Think about it.
This will stand out as one of the most important archaeological sites in North America.
As a former keeper of the National Register of Historic Places, I was delighted to note that in 1986, the Deering was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, having unusually and successfully met the requirements of every category.
In 1992, the Deering estate would suffer another major hurricane, as Hurricane Andrew barreled ashore dead center into the Deering estate. Andrew's 175-mile-per-hour winds and a 17-foot storm surge flooded the stone house, uprooted trees, decimated the landscape, and devastated the Richmond cottage. It would be 1999, after 7 years and $7 million in restoration and improvements, before the Deering estate could once again open to the public. Today, the 444-acre estate is a crown jewel of Miami-Dade County Parks, supported by the nonprofit Deering Estate Foundation and acclaimed for its conservation work, water hydration project, ecological field station, and innovative cultural programming. Charles Deering would have approved of the emphasis on art at the Deering estate, according to his great-granddaughter, Barbara Deering Danielson.
I think he'd be very comfortable because it feels the same. I think he'd be incredibly excited about all the artists in residence, the fact that they're writers and they're graphic artists and there's photography. He was very keen on photography because it's hard to photograph landscape in a hammock. There's light and dark, it's really difficult. Painters, he was a painter and a good painter. Art was all over the place and there were comfy chairs and there were books everywhere and you could put, growing, when I was here as a child, I didn't feel intimidated at all. I just sat down, picked up a book, looked at art and didn't think about it because it was part of the soul of the place. And this is now being recreated and I think it's very exciting.
This special place is a national landmark, visited by thousands every year. They come for love and learning, for culture and leisure. But after everyone leaves and the voices fade and the stillness returns, thanks to the preservation of the Deering estate, here there will always remain the beauty of the sea and sky and the spirits of the land.